In lecture this week, we talked about valency, which is very heavy in the morphosyntax side. So first, we'll cover some background information about case systems. So in English, we see case in our sentences on pronouns. So for example, in English, subjects get nominative case. So if we take a look at the bottom left with our sentences, he likes her and he eats, we see a pattern with how our pronouns are showing up. He likes her, he eats. Both of these are subjects. Eats in this case is intransitive, while likes in this case is transitive. And both subjects take what is called nominative case. And the subject takes what is called accusative case. So he is a nominative case form. While if we take a look at he, that pronoun in its accusative case form, it would be him, like he likes him. So this is one type of case system called the nominative accusative case system. So what we can see in the chart above, where we take a look at, say, what it looks like for English and Japanese, we see two lines. We see AO, and this says when you're in a transitive verb, when you're looking at a transitive verb, it takes two things. It takes a subject, so this is what the A is. This is the subject, and it takes O, which is an object. And when you're in an intransitive verb, you just have a subject. That's all you have. So there's your subject S. And what this is saying is that the subject of the transitive and the subject of the intransitive have the same case. So they have the same form. Now, in other languages, they may use an ergative absolutive system. So in this case, the intransitive subject, S, patterns and it takes the same case as the object of the transitive verb. So this is different than in English. So if we were to look at pronouns in English that had this system, we would see something like this. He likes her. Let's take this as our normal base. When we take a look at an intransitive verb, the subject has the same case as the object of the transitive. So instead of saying he eats, we would get him eats, since him is taking the same form as the object of the transitive verb likes. So this is how the ergative absolutive system works for case. Okay. So we'll see this come up in our patterns today, but just some background information so you can see that. In fact, really, I have a couple more examples that are clear so we can see how this works. So here's a case from Japanese, which is nominative accusative, so much like the English pattern. This says that the subject of the transitive is the same as the subject of the intransitive, same form. So in Japanese, our noun phrases get case markers. So ga is a nominative case marker in Japanese. So whether we have a transitive verb with man or an intransitive verb with book, both of these get the case marker for the nominative case, ga. So they pattern the same. And in the transitive case, the object, book, is taking accusative case, and it is patterning differently than the other two, which are getting nominative case. Okay, so we can see the subjects taking the same markers in both of these sentences here. Now for ergative absolutive, like from Basque or West Greenlandic, we see a different pattern. So what's happening in the transitive sentence is girl, our subject, is getting ergative case. So ergative goes on transitive subject. And the object is getting absolutive case. So we don't use nominative and accusative in the system, obviously. We would say ergative and absolutive. So now when we take a look at the intransitive verb, the girl slept, the girl here is the subject, but it is taking its absolutive form, absolutive case here. That's because the subject of the intransitive takes the same case as the object of the transitive in an ergative absolutive case system. So we don't see that marker here that we saw before on the subject of the transitive sentence. So these are how different case systems can work. So when we analyze problems and we look at morphemes, we need to be aware of what case system we're in, because otherwise we may be looking for something that doesn't exist. But we're looking for patterns that are not in that language. So let's talk about valency, what it is, what arguments are, how valency can change, and how we can model it. So valency is all about the arguments that verbs and deverbals take. So when you have verbs, they can be intransitive or transitive or ditransitive. So intransitive verbs have one argument, which is the subject, or subj. So it has, like, it is monovalent. It has one thing. So you can take Jeffrey sleeps, Nilma ran. In both of these cases, it's just like someone or something did that action. There's no object. Transitive verbs are bivalent. So they take two things, a subject and an object. So in the sentence, they likes pancakes, they love pancakes, or Stephen chases turtles, both of these have a verb where it takes a subject and it takes an object. So we can turn our form into a frame like X loves Y or X chases Y, where X and Y are just two different NPs. Okay. Ditransitive verbs take three arguments, a subject, an object, and an indirect object. And with ditransitive verbs in English, we can change the order. So we have two forms. We have Colin, the subject, gave him, the person receiving the thing, the indirect object, the message, which is the thing being given, that is the direct object. Or we have the kids, subject, sent a package, this is the thing being sent, this is the direct object, to David. David is the indirect object, he is the one receiving it. So we can say X gave Z Y, or X sent Y to Z, where Y is the object and Z is the indirect object. Now, these are types of verbs. And we have this type of semantic case that is assigned to any noun phrase that is not the subject or direct object, and we call this oblique case. And in English, this usually takes the form of an object. So if it's a pronoun with oblique case, it'll show up with him, her, them, and so on. But this will be used to talk about arguments that are related to the verb but are not syntactically required. So I recorded the conversation for Fred. I recorded the conversation. For Fred is completely optional here, but Fred has a purpose. The recording is done for the purpose of Fred, so we want to include this as part of the verb even though it's not required. So this would get oblique case. Or Carl was swooned by another Carlos. This is an agent that has been demoted. It is no longer needed. So it doesn't have to be there, but we can still give it oblique case to say that, well, it is related to the verb of swooning. So let's first take a look at how we can remodel our lexical entries to account for valency, because lexical entries contain information about words. So if verbs have these restrictions on what types of NPs it wants, then we can record that information in our lexical entries. So for an intransitive verb like sleep, we still have our old information, the form of the verb and its category, as well as the meaning, but now we have information about valency. So this says it wants a subject. This is a verb where you have X, you have sleeps, and we need to fill in that X. For devour, which is a verb that takes a subject and an object, here's what we're saying. We're saying it takes a subject and it takes an object. So this would be a frame like X devours Y. So now, how would we do a new lexical entry for give, as in I give horses sweaters? Well, we can do the pronunciation. So there's give as a verb. The meaning is give. And I give horses sweaters. So it takes a subject. It gives sweaters to something, it's horses, so it takes an indirect object, and then it takes a direct object, or we'll just call it OPJ for object. So that would be the entry for give, and if you want to know what the entry for took would look like, it would be very similar to the one for devour. because it is transitive. So we can change the valency of verbs through different valency changing operations, and different languages will use different operations. So one that we're familiar with in English is what's called the passive form. So we take an active sentence and we turn it into a passive. Other languages have things called antipassives, causatives that are explained through word formation, and applicatives, as well as some other types of operations that we'll see in Kurabito 2012, as well as the Smirnova and Shustova paper. So how can we do pacifization? First, let's talk about pacifization in English first, just so we know what's happening. We can take a sentence, he attacked Kevin, and change it to a passive form, Kevin was attacked, and then by him, which is optional. So what's happening in this process is the subject is being optionally demoted. So it's put in this optional phrase. So we can sort of just draw a little X through it as if it's optionally deleted. The object in the active moves up to become the subject of the passive. And in English, we get this little was inserted. So in the little diagram down there, I'm going to write was attacked, just so we know what we're talking about. Okay, so I've used colors to try to track what's happening here. And you'll notice that words are moving around, but the fact that something is still a subject is remaining the same. So we still have subjects in both the active and passive, but the words that are in those positions are different. This is what I'm trying to say. And we know there's some correspondence between the two because we can start with an active and go to a passive and back and forth. So how do we track the change in valency? Well, here's what's happening just in terms of the structure for these verbs. The valency in the active wants a subject and an object. So in our first word schema on the left, our first lexical entry, we can say attacked is a verb that requires a subject and an object. So that's the active form. Then we have a passive, Kevin was attacked by him, where we have a subject and we have this optional oblique. So optional demoted agents. So this is the oblique case that we use to assign to things that are optional. So in this case, on the right entry, we have attacked, a passive verb, which requires a subject and takes an optional oblique element. So we can put a morphological correspondence between them. But is there anything in these word schemas that tracks that movement, that tracks the fact that Kevin specifically was promoted to be a subject, or the fact that it's specifically he, the old subject, that is in that oblique position? No, we don't have anything that captures that in our word schemas. And that's what we want. So we're going to use semantic roles to do this, because semantic roles talk about what the NP chosen by the verb is like. So for example, subjects in English are typically either agents or experiencers, and they're both noun phrases. They both can be proper names. So this is not a syntactic difference. This is a semantic, a meaning difference. So agents are noun phrases that can initiate actions. So verbs like attack and swam and run and jump and perform, these are all verbs that need agents because they need things that can initiate those actions. While experiencers, these do not have to be things that initiate an action, but rather things that can experience some sensation. So I slept last night. Sleeping is not something you actively do, it's something you experience. Or something like Walid felt tired. When you're feeling emotions, this is not an active feeling. This is just something you experience. If it was like I felt something physical, then maybe you're an agent of that verb, because feeling is a physical action when it's with your hands. But this emotional feeling is different. You need an experiencer here. So different verbs might require different types of semantic roles, which is why certain sentences can sound weird, like the rock made me angry. If you're talking about a person, the rock, yeah, that's fine. That's an agent. But rocks, inanimate objects, typically can't cause emotions. So it's weird to say the rock made you angry. So those are two of our semantic roles. We have a few more that are typically things other than subjects. So we have theme or patient. This is the object or thing being acted upon by the verb. Typically, themes are inanimate and patients are animate, but we will not make a distinction. So I hit the ball. The ball, this is what is being acted upon by the verb. This is like the theme of the sentence. We met the kids at the festival. This is the direct object of the verb. This is who you are meeting. So this is the theme of the sentence. Well, the theme of the verb, I should say. Since if you have multiple verbs, you could have multiple themes. We have these other types, which is mainly for oblique case that we see: source, goal, benefactor, and instrument, which we'll see. These are all usually in prepositional phrases. And source and goal are like from some place to some place. So he received a grade from me. This is who you're receiving it from. He came from Rome. This is where you came from. This is the source of whatever you're talking about. And the goal or benefactor is who is getting something, who is benefiting from something, where are you going? So I gave them an F. Okay, they received it from me. Notice that this might also be considered a theme, as it could be an object here. It's the theme of the sentence. It's who you're giving things to. So an NP can have multiple semantic roles. I bought a bracelet for my wife. So this could be a goal because it's going to your wife, but better thing to say is a benefactor. So she's the one directly receiving a benefit from it. So usually a preposition like for has this benefactive meaning. So we're going to use these semantic roles in pacifization to track that movement. So now let's take a look at our pacifization. So we're using the same sentence. I've just added a new line with semantic information. So he is an agent. He is the one attacking Kevin, which is the theme. You could also call Kevin a patient. I'm just going to use theme. Now, when we do movement, so when we do this demotion of the subject and we do movement of object to subject, the position changes. So obviously object and subject will change, but the meaning of the NP in relation to the verb is the same. Kevin is still the theme. Kevin is still the thing being attacked. Even though he's the subject of the passive, he is the thing being attacked, so he is the theme. And this is the same. Same with the agent role. Kevin was attacked by him. Well, he's the one doing the attacking. He's the one initiating the action. So this is still the agent. So even though there's movement, the thematic roles of these NPs that have been moved is still the same. So we can track the movement of the words with these thematic roles. So now in the active form, not only are we looking for a subject and object, but we want a subject agent and we want an object theme. Now if we transform it into the passive, was attacked, we still get that we'll have a subject and an optional oblique. So we still get the fact that the oblique element is optional in the passive form, but we know the oblique used to be an agent and we know the subject is the theme. So if we have a sentence that's using the active form on the left with words already in there, we know how to transform those words into a passive sentence. So we can do that transformation now. We can see that movement in our lexical entries. So we can actually see how the patterns are connected just using information about the verb. Very interesting. So let's see this in a different language with ergative absolutive. So I'm going to rely on the English translation just to help me get a bearing for this problem. So this is in West Greenlandic. The people saw the polar bear. So the people is the subject. So let's find people here. Okay, here's people. This is getting ergative case. So this is ergative absolutive, and this is what we expect. So here's the subject. People saw the polar bear. So the polar bear here is going to be the object. It is getting absolutive case. Okay, And then we have our verb see, which I'm going to use red for. Now, in the second sentence, we have the polar bear was seen by the people. So this is the passive version. So at the front, okay, this is interesting. We see polar bear up front. So this was the old object, but it's now in a subject position because it's at the front of the sentence. It still has absolute case on it. Okay, let's just go with that. I'm just highlighting where things are. So people is now optional, and the case has changed. It's no longer ergative. It's now called ABL. This is called ablative or ablative case. And this is sort of like oblique case, but used for ergative absolutive systems. So you can treat it the same. And then in the verb see, the same thing for the verb, but we now have a passive marker on it. So we can see that we're in a passive. Okay. So what's happening here? Let's just describe what's happening in English first, or with some arrows. So the subject of the active sentence is being demoted into an optional ablative role. The old object in absolutive is being raised into the subject position, and the verb is being modified to show that it's passive. So really, the same thing in English pacifization is happening. So let's model this. Let's model the first one. So we just have some verb, let's call it X. There's no passive, or there's no active marking on it, so we don't need to worry about it. It requires a subject, and it requires an object. The subject is still going to need agency, and the object will still be a theme in this case. So that's what the word order is. I'm still taking word order into account, left to right, subject to object. And then this just means whatever X is in this case. We're being general here. Okay, so that's the active. Now in the passive, what's happening? So this is X. We're adding a passive suffix to it. So let's write that in. This is a passive verb now. We still need a subject, and the subject is the old theme. So we're going to write that in there to know that the new subject is the theme, so we can track it as it changes between forms. And now we have this optional ablative role, which was the old agent. So we can say this is optional as well. And now this is like was X for the passive form. So now we can see a morphological correspondence between the two. And we see it's just like English, but because we're looking at a different case system, we're not using oblique case. Here, we're just using ablative case. So if you want, instead of using subject and object, you could just use the case markers like as they are. So you could say that instead of subject, you have a ergative here. Instead of object, you have absolutive. And you could include that information if you would like. That is an option. So both are available. But that is how we would model pacifization in West Greenlandic. So just to explain what's happening here, you can pause it and look at the data for sentences A and B. Yuma opened the door to the door was opened. This is clearly pacifization. He, you have a pronoun suffix at the front, so this is probably also a pronoun suffix. It also probably agrees with the new subject, so it probably has a meaning like it. And then this marker at the end of the verb is probably the passive marker, so that way it's indicating that you're in a passive. So what's happened here, Yuma in the original subject has been completely deleted, and the object, door, has been moved up into the new subject position. So this is quite literally the same thing that we saw for English, but the word order is, well, the word order is actually the same. So it doesn't really matter where the verb is, it matters what the order of the subject and object are. So of course, I'll just do this one a little bit quicker than the others. So we have a subject and an object that we needed. Juma opened the door, agent and theme. So there's the active. For the passive, we're attaching liwa to the end of our verb to form the passive form. The new subject is the old theme, and well, we don't even have anything there. So we could say that the subject is optional. So we could say that the old subject is optional. So there's oblique for the passive, but to be honest, maybe it can't be included. Who knows? So let's just write it like that, as if the old object has been deleted. But of course, that may be possible, but we don't want to generalize necessarily. Okay, so we'll talk about the other processes fairly quickly. This is just all about removing or gaining more arguments. So all the word schema do look similar in that regard. So what the antipassive does in ergative absolutive systems is it de-specifies the object and makes it optional. So the passive makes the subject optional, the antipassive makes the object optional. So for he killed the people, we see people with absolutive case here. And we have, what is this? This is a transitive verb. So this is going to be our original object here because it's an absolutive case. And we do have a subject. It just happens to be represented by this third person singular. So here is our he. Now, so this is part of this pi suffix. Now, in B, it undergoes the antipassive. So we can see kill the verb, and we can see this new antipassive marker. Just try to highlight that like normal. Okay, there we go. So a new antipassive marker on it, and it is no longer inflecting for subject and object like it did in the first line with 3SG, 3PL. It is now only inflecting for subject, which is still he, because that's the third person singular. So what happened to the object? What happened to the old object? Well, it's still here, but you see it no longer has absolutive case. It is now an instrument. It is now an adjunct. It is now optional. So we can say that this gets, or like ablative case, a type of ablative, a semantic assignment to it. So it is now optional. So the old object has become optional. Now, what does this do in terms of meaning? Well, it's very different from the passive. In terms of the antipassive, if you have a sentence, an active sentence that specifies a group, what the antipassive does is it de-specifies that group. So it says it's not these specific things that you kill or these specific things that you wash, it's just something in general. So he killed people with the antipassive means in general he's a people killer. So in terms of valency here, we do see the object before the subject. So we would have it listed like this. What is the object? The object here is, of course, the theme. The subject is going to be an agent. So I'm just doing valency information here. And then for B, the object has become an optional ablative, which is the old theme. And the subject is exactly the same. It stays as an agent. So that could be how we model the two, the active on top and the antipassive on the bottom. So remember, ablative case is like our oblique case. It is the optional case. Okay, the causative is now an argument introducer. A causative causes a new argument, which is the causer of the action. So in English, we do this by using different verbs, but other languages will do it by inserting morphemes and NPs. So if we have a sentence like Flavio died, and a sentence like Rosa killed Flavio, with the word killed, killed is actually a causative form of die, if we can think about it this way. So we can think of kill as Rosa causing Flavio to die. So you could have your original sentence, Flavio died, which is like having Flavio do the action of dying. And to make Rosa killed Flavio, we can just add in a new subject and add in this causation meaning. So Rosa caused Flavio to die. So let's see this, what this looks like in other languages. So here we have in sentence A, the water boiled. This is our regular sentence. So here is our subject, the water, and our verb is after with boil. And there's some things on the verb that we're not paying too much attention to right now. Now in B, we have Badru boiled the water. Now, I'm identifying the verb boil, and I see there's this new suffix on it, the causative suffix. Okay, so we're looking at a causative. But in the position of subject is Badru now. So we have a new subject. And water has been pushed down further into the sentence. So based on its position, we know that it is an object. We also know that based on the translation of the sentence. So in this case, we have introduced a new subject. Now, in terms of modeling this, of course, in the active form, we need a subject. But what is the semantic role of water here? It's not an agent, because it's not actively boiling itself. It's an experiencer or a theme. You're experiencing the sensation of being boiled. So let's go with experiencer. I think you could put theme in here as well. That would be fine. Now in B, we have new information. We have a new subject, but that's not the same subject. This is now an agent. This is a causer. So we can call this a new agent, or we could even call it a causer if we want to be a lot more specific. And we have an object now, which is there, and it is the old experiencer or theme, whichever one we want to pick. So this operation is being tracked by seeing the subject become an object and a new subject being added to show causation. The last one we'll talk about is the applicative. So this is when you take an optional NP or adjunct NP and make it into an argument. So we call this an applied object, and usually this has some sort of beneficiary or maleficiary, so good or bad meaning, or it has to do with like instrument or goal or location. So I think of this as like taking any sort of adjunct NP, any sort of optional NP, and just making it required. So we start with one sentence A, he or she is eating food. So what we have, I won't talk about all of these markers just because there's a lot. Is focus, so the first one is focus. That's not too important for us. We have the subject here. So one sub. So this will be our he/she or unspecified. So this is a first person. Sorry, not first person. Maybe there's some marking here. Okay, let's just go with this. This is he right now. I'm not quite sure what's up with the marking. We'll say this is he. It's present, it's eating. There's a vowel attached to it for some morphological purpose. And then we have the argument food. And that is our object. The CL7 just means it's part of some class 7. Now, in B, we see an applicative. So we have he or she is eating food for the benefit of the wife. So we still have our object food here. We still have our original subject in the same spot for he/she. And now we have a new object for the benefit or detriment of the wife. So this is the indirect object in this case. So it's adding a new indirect object, and it has this meaning for the benefit or detriment. We also see on the verb itself, we see the applicative marker. So we know we're looking at an applicative verb. In C, we see the same idea. So food, the object is at the end. He or she is eating food with his or her hands. So same process, just different meaning. Instead of a beneficiary, this is an instrumental meaning. So you do it with something. So how you're doing it, with what instrument are you doing it with? And then we have hand as not an indirect object anymore, but as an instrument. So we would call this the oblique. And for the sake of the indirect object in B, you can also call this an oblique as well, because we're reserving oblique for anything that's not the subject or direct object. So indirect objects can be obliques as well. So if we take a look at the forms here, again, I'll just abbreviate information, subject and object. The subject is obviously the agent. The object is obviously the theme in this case, because it's just eating and food. And then for the applicative, the subject and object are still the same, but we have this oblique in the middle, and specifically this IO/oblique in the middle, because it's not optional in this case. And this is taking either the form of an instrument, or it's taking the form of a beneficiary, or some sort of goal. So you can pick whatever word or semantic role best fits it. The agent will still remain as the subject, and the theme will still remain as the object. So this is how we look at the applicative in this case. So we can see all of these operations are changing the valency. It's changing how many arguments are related to the verb in the word. And in English, we do this at a sentence level, but in other languages, this is all done in the word level. So here's some practice. Identify what argument or what operation is happening from A to B, and just show what's happening by highlighting any morphemes that have a causative, applicative, or passive marker, and show what's happening in regular English. Okay, so I'll just talk about this. The first one on the left is a causative. So Rabe suffers to Rozoa makes Rabe suffer. So what I see here is I see the final thing in the sentence is going to be the subject, and Rozoa is filling that information in. So we got a new subject. The old subject has become an object. And we can see that from the accusative case on Rabe. So accusatives will be objects. And then as far as the verb itself, we do see a causative infix. Well, what I think is an infix, it could just be a prefix here on the verb. So that is what's happening in the left case. On the right case, we have an applicative. So the hare is cooking pumpkins. The hare is cooking pumpkins for the lion. We're introducing a new argument. So the subject, hare, is in the same spot in both cases, which makes sense because the applicative is about adding a new object. Okay, so I see pumpkins in both sentences as well. So that is the object. And for is cooking on the verb, we actually see a little marker as well for the applicative. So we know the verb has changed to show that we have that as well. And then I see our new argument lion. So let's call this an indirect object here. And that shows our new object that we're getting in the applicative. So that was it for valency changing operations. There's one more interesting related operation where it's not that a new argument is being introduced, but rather an old argument is picking up another semantic role. So in this case, we have Devadatta makes a mat. So Devadatta is nominative, that's the subject. Mat is accusative, that's an object. And make is singular. Now we have the second form. Devadatta makes himself a mat. So Devadatta nominative, subject. Mat accusative. Make with a middle voice marker. Now, how do we get himself in there if we're not increasing the valency? We don't have more noun phrases there. In this case, what's happening is the original subject was just an agent, and the object, of course, is the theme. But in the case of middle voice, not only is the subject the agent, but the subject has also become the receiver of the mat. So he is also the beneficiary or the goal. And then the object is still the theme. So we can have a case where the valency doesn't change, but the semantic roles do. And why does this happen? It's because the meaning of the verb changes, but the amount of noun phrases we physically hear or read in our sentence has not changed. There is no additional NP for himself here. It is simply the subject taking up another semantic role, another meaning in the sentence. So there's a couple of practice questions if you want to try those. That is it for this lecture. It's 40 minutes, it's pretty quick. But if you have any questions, you know where to contact me.